Right, that is actually 1 o'clock now, and there are people joining, and I'm sure more people will join as we go along. But I think we need to kick off to try and stick to time, if that's okay with you, Nick and Joey. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Good. Okay, so welcome all of those of you who are here already. Delighted to have so many people here again. I see some people who were here last week and some people who are new, so that's great. So it's the second of a series of 3 webinars that we're running this month. The next one, the final one, being the same time next week. If anybody missed the first webinar, which was last week, which had some very interesting conversations. Certainly I enjoyed it very much. That is now, a recording of that is available on the carboncharter.org website. There's a news story there with a recording, and a recording of this one will go up afterwards as well. We'll also try to pick up any questions. If people do have questions today for any of the speakers or anything related to any of that, we will try and stick to time so that we can answer as many of them as possible. Please, if you can just use the chat function, which you will find, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this anyway, but you will find at the bottom of your screen. And if you can just post any questions into the chat, then we will try to pick them up today. If we can't, what we did last time was to try and take some of those off, and we'll answer them in written form afterwards. So we'll try and pick up as many as we can. I think really that's all you need from me. There's much more interesting, more significant people to come. So I think on that basis, I will hand over directly to our regular host, Nick WOOLLEY, to introduce today's keynote speaker. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Ned. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome again from the WOOLLEY team. Last week, in my introduction, I spoke about the amazing initiative being taken forward by the World Economic Forum entitled The Great Reset, backed by the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and very many others. Our opening keynote address was from Neville Ash, UN Environment Director, speaking on an international perspective, placing the environment at the heart of our response to the COVID pandemic. We are now going to hear from another remarkable international speaker, Joey Tabone. I'm delighted to announce that he has now joined the WOOLLEY team as our Associate Director on Climate Change and Sustainability in a part-time basis. For 8 years, he was Chief Advisor on Climate Change to the Australian government, and then he did that for 8 years, and in 2007, Prince Charles persuaded him to come to the UK and work initially with the Prince's Foundation, which is where we originally met and started working together. He now heads up the National Business Response Network for business in the community for Prince Charles. He is also on the boards of the Prince's Environmental Law Foundation, Solving Kids Cancer Charity, and he is also chair of the LGBT charity. As the Prince himself said when launching the Great Reset, this is an opportunity we have never had before and may never have again. We must use all the levers we have at our disposal, knowing that each and every one of us has a vital role to play. Joey will speak to us on how best we in Suffolk, and with the support of our county council, can pull some of those vital levers to bring about the change which is in harmony with our precious environment, helps kickstart our economy, and rebuilds our sense of well-being and equality with our fellow human beings the world over. Joey, tell us all.
Thank you so much, Nick. As usual, that's such a wonderful introduction. I really appreciate that. And your enthusiasm, of course, is something that you're so well known for by many of us who love you dearly. So thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm going to disappear in a minute because I'm going to actually share some slides with you. And I think, as I said to Ned, I hope the great Zoom goddess works with us today and allows this to happen seamlessly, as I'm sure it will. But just before I get into sort of the first couple of slides, I wanted to just give you a tiny bit of background, as Nick has already given some background, but a little bit of background of why I came to the UK. And I spent much of my working career in Australia, as you'll be able to tell from my accent, working for the Australian government in an advisory capacity. And I was with the Australian Greenhouse Office when it first had sort of started up. And the early sort of 2000, before 2000 actually, just before 2000, and spent a number of years there working on various programs. And it's funny that now, and it will come out in the talk, we're starting to see some of these programs and similar types of programs. And I'm going to say this a lot today, but I almost feel like going back, we're going back to the future. So it's sort of, and that's a theme that will continue through the paper that I give. But anyway, I came to the UK because there was this opportunity to work with the Prince's Charities, and I hadn't worked within the charitable sector in a paid capacity before. And I jumped at that opportunity in 2007 to work with the Prince's Foundation for the Built Environment in London, and was very fortunate in those very early days to work alongside Nick and other fellows at the Prince's Foundation, and go on a wonderful journey for quite a number of years, which sort of brings me to where I am today at Business in the Community, another of the Prince's Charities. And I've been here since 2011. So I'm going to share my screen. So just bear with me for 1 minute. And we can get started. Hurrah. Okay, start this thing from the beginning. And I titled the presentation Together We Can, and this is partly because where I'm currently working at the Prince's Responsible Business Network, which is Business in the Community, has really given me an opportunity to bring together so much, I feel, of what I've tried to champion as much as one can in the world, around the importance of organisations and people and governments and business coming together to solve problems. And I think that when I was thinking about this, I thought, what better title than the Together We Can title, which Business in the Community has again been using for the last 18 months or so to show that when businesses come together with government and community, amazing things can happen. And of course, in the current climate, and of course, we're going to mention COVID-19 a number of times, but in the current climate, I don't think that the time is sort of ripe enough to be talking about what we can do when we really put our heart and soul into something. But then I got thinking, hang on a minute, really, we've been talking a lot about sort of back to the future. So rather than sort of focusing on the Together We Can, which I still think is really important, I wonder if it's sort of more apt to call this presentation actually Back to the Future. And it was referenced last week so well in the presentations given by Neville Ash and Councillor Richard Rao, that I think it's also one thing that dawned on me doing a very minimal bit of research about Back to the Future, the movie, was that it's actually the 35th anniversary of that movie. And we do hear so many people saying, if only we knew then what we know now, things might be quite different in the way we approach problems. And that again took me back to 2000 at the Australian Greenhouse Office, where I worked on the nation's biggest carbon reduction incentive program. Again, another important word for today. The Greenhouse Gas Abatement Program was an incentive program. And back then, the Australian government attempted to provide significant incentives to bring carbon emissions down. They're essentially paying business to do more, but the approach was flawed. This is in my opinion, as it was done in isolation of anything else. We slowed down land clearing in Australia, which of course is a really good thing. And our domestic sort of solar implementation program really was a triumph. But generally, industrial emissions continued and continue to rise. Now, there were some really positive moves when I left Australia all those years ago, which was all about setting a price on carbon. And we've heard the debates occur globally. But this was seen by sort of subsequent governments as far too risky politically. Now, I wonder, going back to this theme of Back to the Future, I wonder how they'll feel in 20 years' time. So, the overview of my presentation is here. I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes just reflecting on what we've already heard, and I'm hoping many people had heard the wonderful presentations last week. I'd like to talk about this idea of resetting our relationship with the natural environment. And Nick and I have had many an evening talking about how do we actually reset our relationship with the natural ecosystem. And in fact, His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, on more times than I can possibly remember, often makes that connection and asks that question about how do we reset this relationship. I'd also want to talk about some of the business response, partly because of where I've come from and where I'm coming from at Business in the Community, and suggest that the collaboration between government, between business and the charity or the third sector is part of the solution, really. And we need to continue to remind ourselves of that. I'd really like to also explore for a couple of minutes the challenges and opportunities that we've been hearing that are emerging from the COVID-19 epidemic. And in that, I'd love to be able to highlight a couple of examples of where I've seen it through Business in the Community, some terrific leadership coming from Suffolk County Council. So give a little word to our sponsor there. But I think that that's a really important opportunity to highlight what really is possible at a local level when things are done properly. And when organisations, local authorities, businesses, dare I say the government, really has ambition. Oh, and sorry, just before I go there, why the cow? Cow's not me, obviously, but why the cow? I have a love-hate relationship with cows. I absolutely, when I see a cow in a paddock, I want to run up and hug it, of course. And, you know, it's probably partly because I'm Australian and I sort of grew up in a country area, and I absolutely have always had this affection for cows. But there's another part of me, which is the environmental campaigner, which sort of, it really pains me that I know that we need to do something quite significant and drastic in terms of carbon emissions around sort of our agricultural sector. And it's not to say that we should stop loving cows, of course, because that would be an absolute tragedy, but that we must think of everything that we must do in terms of finding solutions to the problems that we face globally. But I still really love cows. So from cows to whales, of course, on reflecting from last week's presentation by Neville Ash, the director from the UN Environment Programme's World Conservation Centre, and of course, Councillor Richard Rout from Suffolk County Council. Neville had said that, you know, 2020 really was slated to be a big year in biodiversity globally. There were many, many meetings that Neville spoke about, and I'd encourage you, if you haven't already, to listen to that recording. It really is superb. And I think that those events that were slated to happen in 2020 really were shaping up to be a significant turning point in both environmental sort of science and in the political sphere. And of course, the event that sticks out the most for me, because I was gearing up and still am gearing up to have some involvement, was COP26, which was going to be held in Glasgow in November. And I'd been to a number of Conference of the Party meetings, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change meetings around the world when I was in Australia, and of course when I was here as well working for the Prince's Charities, and got to see firsthand just the enormous amount of work that happens at those meetings. And of course, because of what's happened with this curveball that's been thrown at us, being COVID-19, things probably won't be the same this year, and we're going to have to get pretty quick smart. We're going to have to sort out how we can enable the momentum to keep going, because today was such this year of course was such a big year. And of course, Neville did speak about going back to the future a few times with COVID-19, and of course he introduced for us, which Nick's already spoken about as well, this emerging UN dialogue of Build Back Better. And I was only listening to a podcast this morning as I woke up that a former Australian Prime Minister gave, Julia Gillard, and she spoke about the importance of the world focusing on building back better out of COVID-19. And I'm going to dig into that in a minute. We also heard last week about stimulus packages. Now, I think these stimulus packages and these incentives that are being discussed right now, they must not only help the economy to recover, but they really must flick that switch, as Neville said, to a greener, fairer recovery. And I think this is in line with the UN Secretary General's statement recently, that we need to turn the recovery into a real opportunity to do things right for the future. And the UN climate chief has said also, with that in mind, that with this great restart, a window of hope and opportunity opens, an opportunity for nations to green their recovery packages and shape the 21st century economy in ways that are clean, green, healthy, safe, and more resilient. Those words really resonate with me because over the years as a campaigner, these terms have emerged time and time again. And I'm only really starting to see them being discussed together and not in isolation. Now, I think all of this that we talk about really does require systemic change. I know it's easy to say that, but it also requires individual change. And some of the work I've done in my very early days as a green campaigner was around individual behaviour change. And I still think that has a role, but alongside the big changes that are needed, of course. When we talk about net zero carbon and responding to the current climate crisis, we have to discuss the circular economy, and I'll talk about this a bit later. We have to discuss responsible finance and, of course, equality and fairness. And we really, really need to bring these existing targets closer to now. What we spoke about last week was that the rapidly emerging new norm, working from home, being flexible, not traveling as much, being thoughtful about our one planet and the impact we have on it, really does give one some hope that change is possible. And it's probably, I would argue, more possible now than we ever imagined. Targets are achievable. We've demonstrated that. Business, governments, communities can work together and they can achieve common goals. We've seen it happen. COVID-19, I'll end on this slide with this note on this slide, I think is showing us that we can sort of stop everything, even just for a moment. We can think about what we're doing and we can try and change. And this is despite the enormity of the challenges that face us. But of course, all that, it's easy to say all that, climate change and the climate challenge that faces us is still almost too big to comprehend. I find it really big to comprehend, and I've been working in this for most of my life. Temperature rises above sort of 2 degrees are sort of being talked about as if this is almost certain now. And this is what the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is telling us, and the UN is telling us. When I think about when I started in working in sort of climate science and discussing ways to engage people on this issue some 25 years ago, even back then it was almost unthinkable to be facing what we're facing today. And I think that one of the things I recall very fondly was when I came back, when I came to the UK, and I'd worked here over the years, but came here for good in 2007, was that having that exposure to someone like the Prince of Wales that is such a visionary, I felt was really an opportunity too good to refuse. And of course, I think that I was really, talking about going back to the future, when I was reflecting in preparing for this talk on Harmony, the Prince of Wales's book that was produced with Tony Juniper and Ian Skelly, who I was fortunate to work with, and a real privilege in being involved in launching that book back in 2010. Gosh, it does seem like yesterday. But I think even back then and before then, it was generally accepted that the Prince of Wales really was ahead of his time, still is in my view. And looking beyond the sort of sensationalism of speaking to the plants, one wonders if more people did stuff like that, that perhaps we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in now. So back in 2010, only 10 years ago, Harmony spoke about the imbalance facing the world and how this threatens the very existence of life itself. disconnecting from nature is now recognized as a peril that we have to face. And by understanding what we've done in the past and addressing the future with this knowledge, this can help us plan more effectively. I really learnt this through the work with the Prince's Foundations. And I really believe that we can be better citizens, and we can care for the very place that gives us life. And through that work that we did with Harmony, we spoke about the importance of one planet living, and the importance of equality, the importance of fairness, and being in tune with nature. The Prince of Wales speaks about this very passionately, and has for many of the speeches that I've read that he's given. He speaks very, very eloquently about this, the importance of this. At the time of writing Harmony, the Prince of Wales said that we're at an historic moment because we face a future where there is real prospect, and that if we fail the Earth, we fail humanity. And to avoid such an outcome, which will comprehensively destroy our children's future, we must urgently confront and then make choices which carry monumental implications. Now, I do wonder if the Prince of Wales ever dreamed that we would, especially back then, that we would experience in his children's lifetime, which he speaks about a lot, let alone in his own sort of lifetime, such unimaginable disruption that we're living through right now. I don't think therefore that there has been a time in our life when governments, businesses and charities need to come together to find solutions. The work of business in the community where I currently work, in the Prince's Responsible Business Network, I think really does have an important place to play, or an important role to play in all of this, alongside many other charities. So I'd like to just spend a couple of minutes talking a little bit about the charity, because I think where the charity emerged from tells a really interesting story. So business in the community was born out of a response to the Toxteth and Brixton riots in 1982, only 3 years before Back to the Future, when businesses took the initiative to get involved in sort of helping the communities around them that were being so disrupted. And this came with the recognition that a healthy high street needs healthy back streets. That was the mantra back then. And the organisation, the charity's initial role was as an educator and a campaigner, which was one of the things that drew me to the organisation. And they campaigned on individual issues, but this has sort of changed over the years, over its 40-year history. And it's now helping to establish a much wider agenda for a responsible business, and sort of what the old terms of CSR, or corporate social responsibility, were all about. So now many of the businesses we deal with are talking about the importance of placing responsibility at the centre of them, and I'll come to that in a minute, centre of what they do. I think the organisation's also helped to its members, anyway, it has 750 members, realise the potential for creating sort of longer term shared value, and we talk a lot about the importance of shared value. So the organisation really focuses on what impacts are we having, how do we challenge ourselves and each other to do better, the importance of networks and the importance of engaging effectively with communities and with government on issues, and how do we innovate and become as agile as possible to what's happening around us. And I think that the work that we've seen emerge more recently around, and I think Nick mentioned this earlier, on the National Business Response Network and the response to COVID-19, shows that there is a role that organisations like ours can play in bringing people together, bringing organisations together, and matching needs with offers of help. And that's essentially what the National Business Response Network's about. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. What I wanted to describe really, really quickly, and I'm sorry that this slide is a bit sort of busy, but I wanted to talk about what responsible business means for a minute, because I think many companies that we talk to, and many companies in the UK and abroad, they really, really struggle to define what responsibility means for them as organisations. And I'm talking about, the FTSE 250 companies all the way through to smaller organisations. And I think they also find it difficult to understand what the global goals are about, what these UN sustainability goals, as they were called before. And I think that it's important for us to understand what we mean when we talk about responsible business. Now, the colourful, the diagram with the on the right with the circle, with the pink on top and the blue below, if you can see that. The top part, when we're talking about responsible business, is about, you know, understanding what a healthy community looks like, understanding that, you know, one needs to focus on health and well-being of employees, on the education of our future workforce and supporting that development, particularly in STEM skills, etc. The importance of meaningful work and inclusive growth, and of course encouraging organisations to really take a serious look at diversity and inclusion in their workforce. So that's sort of the top half of how we describe what being a responsible business is about. The bottom half, of course, is all about the healthy environment and how you can't really undertake a responsible or have a responsible business approach if you're not thinking about the sort of intrinsic link to a healthy environment and a healthy ecosystem. So the bottom part highlights the importance of sort of a circularity, or the circular economy is being discussed. And net zero carbon, which of course we've heard quite a bit about now. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And also, of course, about healthy ecosystems, which we heard spoken about last week so well. The middle part of this circle, and this is what we use when we're talking to companies, is about the narrative. So if businesses are really, really hand on heart wanting to address being responsible as businesses, they really need to understand their purpose, understand why they exist. And they need to lead at every single level that we're highlighting. Now, underpinning all of this sort of responsible business narrative, of course, as I said, are the global goals. And everything we do going forward must aim to achieve the majority of these goals. And when we're talking to companies, they tend to pick different parts of the global goals and focus on those. And I guess that's where we can start to challenge the companies on, you know, their lower hanging fruit, and then the stuff that they can really get their teeth into and maybe could cause some pain, but could make some incredible strides in. Now, I think critical for business in the community to understand is actually what's important to those companies first and foremost. Are they really serious about about their purpose? What areas do they recognise that they need to improve on, so that we can work together with them to achieve some of those improvements and help them along the way. So, sort of summing up, the vision that BITC talks about is to make the UK the world leader at responsible business. Now, I think this is quite lofty, and again, I'm not going to hide behind these words. I think that this is quite a lofty ambition, but you know, you need lofty ambitions in my view. But I think we also have to recognise that, you know, the UK is doing some pretty damn good things. You know, it's the first country to launch an action plan on business and human rights in response to the United Nations Guiding Principles, as well as the first nation to ask businesses to report on how they're tackling modern slavery. So again, all of these things come under the responsible business banner. We're also one of the few countries in the world to require employers to publish comprehensive sort of gender pay gap data with a view to closing their gender pay gap. And I think we're also leading the way environmentally in some ways, you know, with the largest offshore sort of wind capacity of any country, and in 2019, and again, I want to talk about this in a minute, becoming the first major economy to pledge net zero emissions by 2050. That's really significant.
Joey, sorry, I hate to interrupt. I'm just conscious that we want to leave some time for questions.
Sure.
So I just wanted to make sure you bear that in mind, but do carry on. So it's highly relevant.
No, sure, absolutely. So I will skip to the next slide then, and I'll talk about wanting to give a few examples of how I think business has stepped up to the mark, And I think that the responsible business agenda may have changed, but sadly, I think many of the issues that face our society, are still front and center and still there. I think that it's self-evident that, the scenario is bad for the long-term health and prosperity of the nation. And I think it follows that we still need some fairly strong business-led responses. Greta Thunberg, incidentally, and many people will have heard this, she told us not that long ago that our house is on fire, but we haven't put it out. And can we seriously look into our children's eyes right now, today, and say that we're doing absolutely everything within our power to extinguish that fire? In finishing up sort of our country on this point, I think our country, the UK and the world's not evolving at the pace it needs to, and I think this is clear. And the climate crisis is with us. And I think this generation really needs to hold itself responsible for that. I truly think we're trying, but are we really being radical enough? I don't think we are. However, there's always a however, with a bit of silver lining there. I think we've shown in the last few months that almost anything is possible. And I think that in launching initiatives such as the one we've done with some pretty significant partners, we can show that there are many examples of where the tide could be turning and could be changing. I think that one of the things I really wanted to centre on today is this question of net zero carbon. The UK's goal, of course, as I said earlier, is net zero carbon by 2050. But our challenge to all companies and the nation is that this isn't going to cut the mustard. It's really painful to say it, but it's just not. And of course, since the signing into law last summer of that net zero by 2050 commitment, we've been hit pretty hard by the COVID-19 curveball that I mentioned earlier. 1 year on from that significant commitment of the May government, I think we still don't have a clear roadmap to achieve the targets. There are, of course, some gains with the phasing out of petrol and diesel cars, some questions over carbon capture and storage. I could spend a whole seminar talking about that with my experience from Australia, but I still think it's a fraction of what's needed and what's needed right now. The insulation strategy, incidentally, I think is a good step, as the bulk of household emissions in the UK is from home heating, as many of you will know. But almost every day we are urged by scientists, by people in popular media, and by some governments from around the world that the increase in temperature is moving us closer, unfortunately, to those catastrophic events that have been, and some of which we've already experienced. Only today, the media was reporting, I was reading this morning, that the 1.5 degree increase is now highly likely. And if we go above this, we'll see the worst impacts of the climate crisis and climate change. I can't help think about what it would be like to go back to the future right now. What would I have done differently 20 years ago? What would governments have done differently? And of course, what would our business leaders have done differently? I think the calls we hear from Whitehall for a COVID-19 recovery linked to a green recovery is good, obviously. But we have to bring our net zero carbon commitments forward to at least 2030, just as Suffolk County Council has done. 2030 is possible, but more significant incentives for businesses, for governments, and for the community are needed. They're needed right now. I think we've shown through COVID-19 and the response that incentives are effective. And not that I would discourage people from using their £10 pub offer from the government announced this week, but I fear we need bolder and more far-reaching incentives if we're going to achieve the ambitions that we need to achieve. As I said, I think the insulation program is definitely a step in the right direction, but it's a great opportunity, in my opinion, with stimulus goals to simultaneously satisfy the environmental goals as well. There's some great case studies, by the way, in Australia and New Zealand on the insulation incentives, if anyone wants to Google those. So in summary then, I think COVID-19 has seen the world react, respond and realign. The huge collective effort to quite literally transform life as we know it was unimaginable until now. And I think that shows that dramatic change is actually possible. And we all know that to start to address climate impacts, we need to see a dramatic change. But I hasten to add that if we are to tackle the massive challenges facing us and facing the planet, we do need those bolder ambitions. I can't stress that more. Inspired by the innovation and action taken at pace and scale since the pandemic hit, we need to hear more about how we're going to build back better while creating a fairer economy and society. And it goes without saying, I'm sure to this audience on this webinar, that to restore ourselves, we must first restore the planet. We need to accelerate the speed and scale of what is delivered to drive a recovery that is economically, environmentally, and socially sustainable. The UN report this week said we are tackling the symptoms and not the cause. And that COVID-19 is a dress rehearsal of what is to come in terms of climate change impacts. So for over 50 years, the Prince of Wales has promoted action for a sustainable future to ensure that natural assets can endure for future generations. And in January, and this is what Nick's going to talk about, I think that the Prince launched his Sustainable Markets Initiative at Davos, which calls on communities, businesses, investors and consumers to take the urgent and practical steps required to transition to a more sustainable future, more sustainable practices. And the Great Reset, which Nick will address, I think aims to rebuild, redesign, reinvigorate and rebalance our world. It's urging businesses and communities to build back better by putting sustainable business practices at the heart of their operations as they begin to recover from this current crisis of COVID-19. This is surely part of the solution and a really important step in the right direction. Now to segue over to Nick, the lovely Nick WOOLLEY, I said I love with all my heart, whom I'm certain will reflect on what would the Prince do if he could go back to the future in his Aston Martin. Over to you, Nick.
Joey, if that's okay,
questions.
We'll actually have some questions for you, if that's all right. We've had a number of questions come in, so we'd like to deal with those directly.
Lovely.
So yeah, thank you. It's particularly relevant. I think it followed on very nicely from last week as well. And I'm encouraged to hear that there's some fairly alarming things in there, but encouraged that you do see a real window of opportunity for us now. So there's two questions that have come in that are specifically on that around, Steph's asked, how can small businesses build back better and take advantage of this kind of window of opportunity you mentioned? And then there's a related question to that, I think, from Sarah saying, if Build Back Better is going to work, isn't that actually about us getting a steer from government? And perhaps that message isn't coming through all that clearly so far. Is it possible to create a healthy ecosystem in a capitalist consumer society? So that's just a little one to throw out to you there.
No, really, really good question. I think on the small business piece, you know, absolutely. I think what we're seeing is, and again, I can reflect on some of the experience I've had in business in the community, where we try and match that assistance that some of the larger organisations are offering to local organisations, and particularly small businesses who are at the sort of the lifeblood of so many communities. You know, it's, I can't remember the figures, but it's an extraordinary number. Over 90% of people are employed by small businesses. So yes, very much so. Build Back Better must address helping smaller businesses and particularly SMEs recover more quickly. And I didn't mention that one of the ambitions that we've had at Business in the Community is try and move and help businesses move from this crisis phase. It's very, very difficult when you're right in the middle of a crisis, which I firmly believe we still are, but move them from this crisis phase into the recovery phase, which is the longer term piece. And I think that's where Build Back Better and the narratives we're hearing, not only from within the charity sector, but globally at the UN, will start to hopefully change the way some things are occurring. The second part of the question, absolutely, I think needing more of a steer on how we're going to actually build back better. And I think that's what I was agitating around. You know, it's great having incentives, but we need to do more. We need to do more very quickly. If I think back, and part of the talk that I skipped over was I had some reflections on what happened during the global financial crash, that crisis that I'm sure many of us will remember. And I recall that in Australia, we essentially just printed more money and pumped money into the economy. I'm not sure whether that's the solution, to be quite honest. And we're sort of seeing a bit of that happening now here, of course, in the UK, with all these big packages being announced and levels of assistance. But I think that, you know, the green recovery, the most heartening thing for me is that I keep hearing time and time again that we need to match the recovery that we need to a greener recovery, and that is the future. So many businesses as well as governments are talking about this, and I think that we now need to see that happen in reality. So I hope that answers some of the question. I'm happy to talk further about it offline if
yeah, so I mean, I think we're going to overrun slightly, but I think these are such interesting issues that obviously if people need to leave, then we'll understand that, and we will make the recording available for people who want to come in and check the end if they have to miss that. So I mean, Nick, I see you've raised in the chat there, just following on from what Joey's just been talking about, the Lord Debon's challenge that government recovery funding shouldn't be about propping up businesses that have no place in our vision for a zero carbon society. I mean, is that, you know, you've mentioned that we see a lot of talk, but is that the level of action that you think we need to match that talk?
Do I think so? Yes.
That's a very clear, definitive answer from Nick. Thank you.
I think it's essential, but can I just touch on the last question that Joey was on, because I think there are two answers. One, government has to be absolutely strong and firm in its resolve to build back, not just better in general words, but build back green, because that is what is the only way that we can go forward successfully and overcome the plethora of horrors that Joey has been referring to so interestingly in his talk. So I think there are two answers. One is that government has got to be firmly resolved to take firm action. Two, I think small businesses have got, certainly when they're in Suffolk, the greenest county, the answer is that they should be getting in touch with you and yours and getting the excellent advice that you have given us going along the way. We had a whole mass of ideas that we put in place right from the start before we got in touch with you. But you have so helped us in our thinking to enhance what we were doing, to be doing what we're doing now, and at the same time being more successful in our business as a result of it. You can help any number of businesses in Suffolk if they will get in touch with you.
Absolutely, we'd love to hear from them. And just one last question, if we may, then Joey. Then I think we will have to move on. We've got a short, but I think really important film to show. So there's a question that's come in from Charles that I think is very relevant on the international perspective of this, which is that some places have to pay so much interest on debt that they don't have available funds for green investments. He's cited a solution there, a proposal from primeeconomics.org, which I'm not aware of, but I think that question of this balance of debt, particularly as we come out of the current pandemic crisis, and there will be the traditional focus on tackling unemployment and recession and so on, and how do you balance that with a green recovery and green investment? I
mean, I think this is where our friends at the UN and many of the global partners that are on the sort of global stage have a really important role to play. And I'm sure that the green investment piece and the issue around debt, particularly in developing economies, will have been fairly front and center of the COP26 discussions in Glasgow in November. And I'm sure that whatever form that takes virtually, which I'm sure it will in November, that issue will be addressed at that global level. But I think it's clearly it's so fundamentally important to the world finding its way through this climate mess that we're in. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those issues aren't new issues. That's been the issue of debt, particularly in developing economies, has been an issue for as long as I've been involved in climate change and the climate science, and it's only gotten worse, really.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. we're going to move straight on. We have a short video to show, and then we'll hopefully have a bit of time for questions afterwards if people can hang around. I appreciate we're running slightly later than we'd said we might. But the video, I think, is well worth seeing. It's about a 10-minute film. Two things. One, because it takes us virtually out to Freckenham, which is where we ought to be, of course. Though today is probably a day to be doing it on webinar, weather-wise, but still. But it's nice to get a little vision of it. And the other thing is that we've talked about the big concepts and the big ideas, but it's also about those practical small responses. And I think it's a really excellent example of some of the issues and the things that we see more and more businesses asking about in terms of renewable energy and battery storage and net zero goals and going off grid, and to see all of that really happening at a small business here in Suffolk, I think is fascinating, well worth seeing. Please do stick with it. Just a tiny warning that the video begins outdoors. It's lovely to see the outdoors at WOOLLEY, but the sound quality isn't 100% perfect, so bear with it. It becomes much better when we move inside, just a couple of minutes into the film. Peter, thank you.
Hello and welcome to Rectory Cottage at Freckenham, WOOLLEY Project Management Limited. Normally, as you know, we have a summer party here, but sadly, the situation, that's not possible. So instead, we're welcoming you to a series of 3 webinars, and this is just a quick one because I'm often asked about how we use our solar power and whether it really works, is it effective, and so forth. So today's an opportunity where I'm going to show you all about our solar panels and how we store the energy and how we use it in the house. Okay, so come with me and let's have a look at these panels. As we go, we pass by our little tiny vegetable garden, which in fact is part of our sustainable way of living. It provides us with a lot of the vegetables we enjoy. And this year, new idea, last year we had to replace all the windows in the cottage, sadly, because they just about died. And so I took down the old windows together with the secondary glazing, was left with the secondary glazing, and I thought, this is too sad, I don't want to waste it. So I took the panels out from the glazing and I put them around the vegetable garden, and it fits almost perfectly, and golly, it's making the vegetables grow. So anyway, come over and see the main feature that we want to show you, which is the solar panels. You'll see we've got three rows of 10 solar panels, which together produce on a really hot day up to a maximum of 8 kilowatts per hour. Now we've seen the solar panels themselves, let's go and see where we store the power when it's surplus. So come with me into the old ancient garage by the at the end of the house, and here we have the Tesla Powerwall. Now this Powerwall stores 13.5 kilowatts of power, which I try to keep it topped up to by the end of each day if possible. And you can see the switches on and off, and the cabling then takes it back into the building, which is right beside the electricity grid incoming box. So it all marries up beautifully in there. So that is 13.5 kilowatts of power. And outside here, we have the wonderful My Energy Zappy, which is absolutely invaluable, so that when we want to, we can power our cars straight off this power. It's wonderful. We get the energy completely straight free, comes off the panels and then comes into this wonderful box here. And we can also tune this so that it's as eco as we want it to be. If we need to be charging fast, we set it on fast charge. But if the sun isn't shining that hot and we don't want to drain the Powerwall in there, I then put it on to eco. and it then charges much more slowly at about maximum of 3 kilowatts an hour instead of 7.5. And if it's a really dull day and we're in no hurry at all, we put it on to Eco plus 2 leaves, and that does it even more slowly, which it'll go down to in a moment probably. But that means we protect running out of electricity and having to use that terrible thing called the grid. So, now you've seen the solar array down in the field next door, you've seen the Powerwall in the garage, which is just the other side of this wall here. So the cables that you saw coming into the house come through into this Tesla inverter, which is a very, very clever box of tricks, and which enables everything to happen, and happen very safely as well. This inverter then takes the electric current generated direct into the grid. So that by doing that, it couldn't be closer. And what is remarkable is that Tesla are the first people who seem to have been able to produce switchover gear that allows us to have this installed in this way. Because if the grid goes down, we still have an instantaneous, as near as damn it, switchover from the grid purely to a combination of the Powerwall and the solar panels, and so we don't have a cut in our electricity supply. It's completely seamless, you can't tell. And so this thing is a very clever piece of equipment. So the wonderful thing about having a Tesla car is you get a thing called a Tesla app to put on your phone. And this not only tells you what's going on with your car, but it also tells you what's happening with your energy sources and supply in relation to the Tesla Powerwalls. Now, here it gives you an example of the actual usage in the house and everything powered by the house during the whole day, and you'll see it goes on a fairly even keel, just with a few blips when somebody does some cooking or whatever. So that's the usage in blue. Next, we have the amount of power that's been generated off the solar panels during the whole day, and you can see there we developed just over 26.5 kilowatts. And that was during a day when there was quite a lot of cloud as well. Then the third thing that it tells you is what is happening with the Powerwalls. So to begin with, you'll see the Powerwalls are powering the house with the green above the line. And then as soon as the solar panels start working at about 7:30 in the morning, they start recharging and taking over running the house. And what's more, as the power develops, you'll see that green line goes deep down south, and that is recharging the Powerwalls and then covering whatever else is happening in the house for the rest of the day. So that's the Powerwall performance. The next thing we have to see is what's actually happening with the grid. Now, as you will find out in a few moments, we haven't used much from the grid during the day, in fact, hardly anything at all. We've actually used 0.1 of a kilowatt during the whole of the day, and so all that grey area is energy that's being provided by the solar panels and going straight into the grid and feeding my feed-in tariff payment. So that's absolutely lovely. And then finally, you can see all four graphs put together, and you can see how they all fit into one another. And that, I find, is a very neat and useful thing to have that I can look at any time of day or night. This chart shows how the power comes in from the solar panels and is feeding into the Powerwall at this moment, and also firing up what's needed in the cottage. So you've seen how the power comes in and is used around the place, and this shows the amount that we were self-powered for today, which, as you'll see, is 98%, of which 63% is direct from the sun, and 35% is from the Powerwall. So we use so much more at this time of year, obviously, from the solar, but nevertheless the Powerwall is invaluable. So 98% for the day, but when we look at the whole of the month of June so far, we've also had 98%, with 59% from solar and 39% from the Powerwall. In May, we had 97%, but 65% from solar, 32% from the Powerwall, because it was so sunny. In April, it had gone down a fraction to 96%, and here you'll see it was a little more than half from the solar and a little less than half from the Powerwall. In March, the first part of March was pretty poor with not good sun, but we still managed to get 65% overall off-grid. And here, as you'll see, it's almost exactly half from solar and half from the Powerwall. So with no Powerwall, we would only have been just under a third self-sufficient, but with the Powerwall, almost exactly 2/3. February was 53%, but here, as you'll see, solar was only providing 20%, Powerwall 33%. January, we had 58%, but here it was only 20% from the sun direct and 38% from the Powerwall. So, as you'll see, in the winter months, that Powerwall is absolutely crucial. Just to prove that we do have a whole lot of cutouts of grid power, which we don't necessarily normally pick up. This shows since October we've had 53 power cuts, and in the last few days we've had quite a number too. Okay, well, I hope this has been of some interest and has given you some food for thought as to how, with the provision of solar panels and also Powerwalls or similar, you can actually provide a great amount of the electricity you need in your home. Anyway, if any of you have got any further questions or would like to know any more, you've got our website. Please get in touch with us and we'll be delighted to give you any information you can to help. Thank you so much for watching.
Great, very many thanks, Nick. It's, I think, a really excellent opportunity to be able to highlight some of the things that businesses are doing. I'm sure there are other people out there doing other things in their own businesses as well, and we would always like to hear those examples. We would love that opportunity to put the word out there. I'm going to put one question to you, Nick, if that's okay, just off the back of that film, and then I think we've got a number of other questions, and I think we're just going to have to take some of these offline and deal with them afterwards if we can, if you're happy to provide responses later on. But Jackie has asked why the Powerwall needs to be at 13 kilowatts. How do you know the size of the Powerwall that you need if your solar panels are a maximum of 8 kilowatts? And also asking, very relevant question, of course, about the current cost of a Powerwall.
Right, it's a very good question. Thank you, Jackie. The reason is, one, we can only have 8 kilowatts of solar array because that's the maximum amount that one's allowed if you're lucky for a residential unit. So we can't have more than 8, but that's fine because that produces potentially much more than is going to be needed at the time of delivery from the sun, if you like. And that is why we need the Powerwall. Now, we need the Powerwall to have more capacity because without something like 13.5 kilowatts, it's not going to last us through in bad weather conditions, poor solar generation conditions, that is, what we need in the house. What is fascinating when you watch the app during the day is the amount of additional power that is generated from solar over and above what you actually need to run the house at that moment. And so rather than the power going to waste or being refed back onto the grid, it first goes to fill up the battery, which you're going to need to keep you going over the 24-hour period. And indeed, if the grid was down for some time, you would need that backup. It could be down for 1 or 2 days. We've got enough to keep us going for that, as it is, but we need that. As far as cost is concerned, the Powerwall cost us a little bit over £6,000, and the solar panels cost us, from memory, I think it was 11. So that's the total cost. But both those prices are going to be coming down increasingly in future.
I mean, we've certainly seen that. You've seen that in solar panels. We've seen it in electric vehicles. We've seen it, and I think storage is kind of at the early stage of that process. We do expect it to come down significantly. We've got more and more questions coming in, and there's some really important issues here around the links between health and climate change and global debt and the global things as well. And there's lots of things I would like to carry on. I'm afraid I think time has got the better of us. So what I suggest we'll do, Joey and Nick, if that's okay, if we circulate the questions afterwards, if you're happy to provide any comments on that, and then we'll make those available.
Sure.
We will also be back here next week for the last in this little series of our mini series of webinars. And we will undoubtedly pick up on some of these conversations if people are able to join us then. We'll have David Taylor from the Urban Engineering Studio, and we'll also have a little focus on sort of breaking news in electric vehicles, which I think is something that we certainly from Business Energy Efficiency Anglia, we see a lot of interest in at the moment. But I think really it only remains for me to say thank you very much indeed to Nick and to Joey for stimulating the debate, for being able to join us today. I've really enjoyed it. I would love to be able to continue doing these. We've got sort of 3 booked in, but I think we will look at how we can do this, because I think the appetite for these conversations is there, and we're learning from that. We might look at having some, maybe picking up on some of the individual topics that have come up and coming back to those in a bit more depth later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ned. And thanks to Suffolk.
Thank you.